Good evening and welcome to For the People and the second part of our series with Dr. Sterling Stuckey, author of Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory, and the Foundations of Black America. Dr. Stuckey is professor of history at Northwestern University. He has received fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences and from the Smithsonian Institution. We begin this segment by asking Dr. Stuckey about the role African slaves played in the successful cultivation of rice in the South.
Yes, I suppose it was Martin Delany who, the black nationalist of the 19th century and physician and associate of Frederick Douglass, who first wrote about the experience in a way at least that was accessible to significant numbers of black intellectuals. In the 1850s, Delany observed that in one of his essays, Political Destiny of Black People, of Colored People, that the African was responsible for teaching the plantation overlords the means of cultivating rice. In historical circles in recent decades, the significant work on the subject is Peter Wood's book, Black Majority, in which Wood suggests that with the importation into South Carolina of rather sizable numbers of Africans, particularly from the area of Sierra Leone, Mendes and Tendes and so on and the like, that in the 1690s, in the colonial period, it was during that decade that South Carolinians somehow hit upon the means of cultivating rice after having tried and tried and tried. These Africans who were brought in from this section of Africa, from Sierra Leone, came from regions that for centuries had cultivated rice. And so the inference here in Wood's book is that they were responsible basically for teaching South Carolina whites how to cultivate rice. And of course it's not difficult at all for one to believe when one considers the fact now, I think one can call it a fact, that Africans have been cultivating grain from some 15 to 18,000 years before the birth of Christ. Apparently, they were the first, according to a number of anthropologists, to cultivate grain in Kenya some 18,000 years before the birth of Christ. So they were people who gave the world the hoe. They gave the world the hoe, despite the fact that they continually broke hoes in order to sabotage the system of slavery, and acted as if they were so stupid that they didn't know the uses of the hoe. They'd given the world the hoe. And by applying African means of agriculture here in South Carolina in the 1690s, almost 3 centuries ago.
How did you plant, cultivate, and harvest rice when you were coming up?
Well, when I was coming up, and I remember my father planted rice, and they was planted in a branch, like a low place.
A low place.
Low place in a branch. And then that's what we call the lowland rice. Yeah. Then you see that they planted and with a hoe. Then they have no plow down that. They trench it.
You plant that with the hoe.
With the hoe.
Make little hole.
Yeah, you make little hole.
Little hole.
Little hole.
And drop it in.
And drop it, yeah, and drop it in. Yeah, then they come behind, one come behind, and they'll cover it. Then when the rice get up, then we will go and then Papa will carry out there and then we hold that with the hoe.
Yeah, hold the hoe.
The hoe. And draw that up thing. But all one time
what kind of soil did you use? Was it planted in?
Planted, not heavy.
Heavy soil. And then mud. Use something you bog into the plant. Like you plant it, you bog in going right down. You understand? Yeah, that's what you call the one down in the branch. Now you know how to feel in that place, but the rice and the low place. Okay. All right, then you walk it.
So you just have to chop it one hoe at one time, and it grow fast up quick, just like regular grass. And then the seed we call the rice would come up there and turn on the side like candles. It would look beautiful, and it'd be so nice and so good, and look so good rather. And when you done that, when it dry now, but it's green, and when it doesn't dry, it'll be turned, on the two sides like that. It hangs on there like candles. And so when you've done that, you go and cut it, and then you bundle it, tie it in bundles, and you can put it on a rack and let it get dry like it's supposed to. Then you stack it in your barn, and then if you're going to carry it to a mill or something, some people carriers have got so much to carry to the mill, but like we was not able to, go to no mill, so we would stack it in the barn, and every time we wanted to beat somehow, get some rice to cook, we had to go and beat it. You take the mortar, you have a big old, get a tree, then they burn and make
cut a hole out in it?
You burn it till it get a good hole in it, so you could put the rice down in it. And when you put
after you harvest it, you put it in, you trash it off. You trash it off. Spread about 3 or 4 sheet, cotton sheet, used to pick cotton in. And you put I tell you what we used to do. Have a big mortar or a log, a little piece of log, and you put that on the, put them on the sheet. How about 3 or 4 sheets, I say, because when you lick it, for trash it, you trash it all over you need, but you have to have enough sheet to hold it. Then we used to put a big mortar on there, big heavy thing, anything heavy, and trash it off. Open that bottle and trash them.
So the slave master, the whites who brought the Africans here, in this context, they were actually bringing, in many cases, skilled labor.
Skilled laborers. Delaney suggests that tobacco, hemp, cotton, and other crops were cultivated in North America by the Africans initially. They apparently taught whites how to do that, just as the Africans were, in the main, the masters of horsemanship, so that in the 19th century in this country, most of the great jockeys were black. The slaves who led the slave masters through regions like this in hunting parties were masters of hunting techniques. In South Carolina and North Carolina and in other places in the South, frequently the slaves were the best fishermen around, which led to violence with white fishermen because slaves might sometimes bring their catches to market. So the slaves had...
That was a pathetic situation. I was reading in your book about how the whites that you're talking about now, they resented the African slave fishermen. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, see, one feature of this is that, as David Dalby, the British linguist, has pointed out, one that has almost been completely ignored by historians in this country, irrespective of color for that matter, is that very frequently, Dalby argues, the Africans found themselves surrounded by white people who were less gifted than themselves. Very often, he says. He called that one of the bitterest aspects of slavery, is that you had Africans who had come from areas of Africa in which they had shown a mastery of certain forms of art. Areas of Africa where the string instruments had been played for 1,000 years, Dalby says. And thus, when they got here and they picked up the fiddle, they became some of the most effective fiddlers around. Areas of Africa where you had priests and priestesses performing, caught up in that slave net and brought to North America to be confronted with a European people, in the case of the colonists who came here, who came from the lower rungs of European society, who could not possibly compete with them in artistic and spiritual terms. And yet they found these people lording it over them. And so I think Dalby's point is especially forceful when one bears in mind that out of North America there has been one after another creative bursts in the arts, and almost invariably they come from the black community. And this is not something that was created, that occurred in a vacuum. These people came from, the Africans who were brought here came from cultures millennia in the making, came out of traditions of musicianship that had been cultivated over a period of 1,000 years or more.
What were the trickster tales?
I guess the supreme expression of the trickster tales would be found in Brer Rabbit, whose home was as much in a cemetery like the one behind us over there as anywhere else, the Bur Rabbit has not been presented as a sacred figure. Bur Rabbit has been presented as a ladies' man, as a sporting man, as someone who, I guess the term is amoral, as an amoralist. One finds Bur Rabbit in a number of manifestations, and quite possibly one of his most important manifestations is Bur Rabbit as a man of God. The trickster tale in this sense is, and trickster tales generally feature qualities of mind that enable the trickster to outwit the opposition, the slave to outwit the master. Intelligence is something that has not been stressed in dealing with slavery. That is the regard that the slave had, that the African had for intelligence. But I think it comes, one finds it coursing through tale after tale that the slave created, is that above all, intelligence is given primacy in slave tales. And it takes the quality of the weak very often, of the weak, the small, and the weak, outwitting through superior intelligence the strong and powerful. I would say that would be perhaps the most outstanding characteristic of the trickster tale.
How do you think Christian concepts of death differ from traditional African concept of death?
I think one of the most distinguishing features is that with the African, there's an ongoing reciprocity between the living and the dead. Once someone dies, there is a day-to-day relationship that is maintained. You put out food in traditional African societies to nurture the spirits of the deceased. You put out water or some other drink in order to quench the thirst of the deceased. This, of course, is a symbolic act, but it has the tremendous benefit of somehow easing the pain that has occurred of one so close to you having left. The pain is eased through this ongoing relationship that one maintains through these symbolic acts with the deceased. Moreover, the dead become a major inspiration for creativity in African religion. That is why so much of the creativity that takes place in African religion takes place in a circle during the ceremonies to show one's respect for one's ancestors of the gods. That is why in North America, here in South Carolina, in Louisiana, and elsewhere in the South during slavery, almost all of the important creative forms that came out of slave communities came during the course of the circle dance, during the course of the ring shout, which was above all a dance and a song dedicated to the ancestors. So the sacred ground of the dead, and one finds the ring shout being done time and time again in cemeteries, the sacred ground of the ancestors becomes the primary ground of spiritual and creative being, so that you get, as a result of the inspiration of the ancestors, the artist creates, and creates endlessly, so that you get a great premium placed on endless variations on a theme, placed on creativity. The permanent factor there, the constant, is continuing regard, constant regard for the ancestors and for the dead.
But the Christian attitude.
The Christian attitude, and I'm no authority on the Christian attitude, but I do know that once one dies in most Christian communities, that's basically it as far as one's ongoing relationship with them. As far as ceremonies take place, you may see them later in heaven according to the Christians, but there is no day-to-day, there are no day-to-day symbolic acts performed in order to keep those deceased people close to one. You may go out to the cemetery once or twice, a half dozen times a year, if that often, to show your respect for the deceased, whereas with the African, it's a day-to-day thing. And thus the pain of death, I believe, is polarized, is much sharper for the Christian than for the African. The African somehow is able to assuage, to mitigate to mitigate that terrible situation by continually relating to the deceased through these symbolic acts.
You're touching on this, and I don't know if you have anything else to say about it, but how important were funerals to the African slave?
Well, first to the African, funerals were extremely important, so much so that African women and men sometimes joined as many as 5 or 6 different secret societies, burial societies, so that when they died, they will have put in enough money so that a big funeral can be given for them, so they can be given an honorable burial. So they belong to many different burial societies or secret societies in Africa to assure themselves of a proper funeral. And thus you can appreciate the problem with which Africans were confronted when brought to a new land as slaves and having to work with the slight resources available to a slave, die, and their relatives had to be concerned about giving them a good and decent burial with so little available to them in order to do this. Nonetheless, as often as they could, they did give them as fine a burial as they could, as fine a burial as conditions of slavery permitted. But it was not just the supper that might be eaten after the funeral that was important to them. The proper burial would mean the appropriate rituals would be formed. In particular, the ring shot would be formed where people would gather in groups of anywhere from 12 to 20 people, gather themselves into a circle and move in a counterclockwise direction around the casket or around the tombstone to show their respect for the deceased.
Now, burial per se, you talked about the decorating of the grave. Would you address that?
Well, before doing that, just to give, I think, everyone an example of how fundamental burial was to the African, and therefore to the offspring of the African, one could point to certain traditional, let's say, Nigerian peoples who buried their dead under their homes, so that the dead become the foundation, you see. The dead become, in a very literal sense, the dead, as well as becomes the foundation of one's household, the dead. Now, very often they were taken to a special burial ground, but not infrequently they were buried beneath the homes of the living. And they are the foundation of their lives.
Literally and figuratively.
Exactly.
Talk some, if you will, about the importance of decorating the grave, and maybe decorating is not even the right word, but talk some about that, if you will, please.
Yeah, it was very common among slaves that they decorate the grave by constructing a burial mound. One finds this not only in the South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Maryland. One also finds it in New York, places like that during the slave era. It was so because it was such a dominant characteristic of African cultures in Central Africa and in West Africa. And one notices that in the areas from which the Africans were taken and brought here, these characteristics of culture were practiced. The burial mound becomes an important symbol of one's ongoing relationship with the deceased, and therefore things have to be done in a proper manner. If you don't do things in a proper manner, you could very well join the deceased if they're not done in a proper manner. For example, if you don't break certain objects before placing them on the grave, you lay yourself open to possible death. It was an important matter because, as I've suggested in the book, because Africans place such a priority on living a good life and then giving symbolic expression to the life that one has lived by having a good funeral. And thus, lots of Africans belong to many different burial societies in Africa, so that at the time of death, they would be well taken care of. There would be the funeral supper, there would the feast, and there would be an appropriate burial for them. So too in slavery, as much as they could possibly work that out for themselves, so that one finds that the burial mound was generally constructed. One finds the existence of a burial mound in ceremonies that in many ways might be just as a Christian ceremony. One might think it's just a Christian ceremony, but one finds an African burial mound with an object that was particularly associated with the deceased placed on that mound, sometimes with ribbon grass or with seashells, which has all sorts of symbolic significance. The seashell has all sorts of symbolic significance because, particularly among the Bakonga, it suggests circularity. The formations on the shells suggest circularity and brings to mind the cross and the circle and the four moments, the movement of the sun in the counterclockwise direction. I just noticed as I look up, the sun is moving not in a counterclockwise direction, but in a clockwise direction from east to west here, so that as you move in a counterclockwise direction and you notice that the sun is moving in the opposite direction, you know you're in the New World. You know you're in the New World. So that the African knew that he was in the New World when that sort of movement took place. Kind of, in a way, it might be interpreted as a means by which you resist the forces of the New World, oppression, since you're moving against the sun, so to speak. But all of that is related to the burial ceremony, especially for the Bakonga.
Now, spirituals, you say that we have a narrow understanding of them. What do you mean by that?
First, I suppose I should say that when I say we have a narrow understanding of the spirituals, I should perhaps say that intellectuals have a narrow understanding. The people who practiced the spirituals during slavery certainly didn't have a narrow understanding of them. The people whom I saw practice the spirituals a day or two ago, not too far from here, at the Moving Star Hall. The Moving Star Hall singers didn't have a narrow understanding of the spirituals, which they sang, which each time they sang, they rose to dance to.
Was that on John's Island or where?
On John's Island, yes, yes. What I mean in the book when I talk about people having a narrow conception of the spirituals is that most academics and many middle-class black people, just leave whites aside for the moment, when they think of a Negro spiritual, think of the song. They don't think of the song in relation to dance. Is that correct? They think of the song. We've seen the song move onto the concert stage just with the piano, usually. We see the song abstracted from its natural context, which is that of the ring shout, and placed on a concert stage or in a choir like the Fifth Jubilee Singers or the Hampton Singers and so on. We see it in that context. We don't think of the spirituals as something that almost invariably was accompanied by dance in the slave quarters or wherever the slaves performed the music and did the dancing. In that sense, we're talking about them being narrowly viewed, and thus, taken from that context, they're taken from the context of the ancestors and of the elders that gave inspiration to their creation in the first instance. We see that the Negro spiritual is a way not only of showing respect, let's say, for a Christian God, but it's also a means by which one shows ongoing respect for those who've gone before one, for one's ancestors, and for the elders who are still alive and who may be involved in dancing while singing a spiritual at the moment in which the ceremony takes place. So it's a much more complex thing, and it's a much more expansive conception than we've been led to believe.
What was the Africans' attitude toward Christianity?
Well, I think there were attitudes and there were attitudes. I think that there were Africans who were quite prepared to embrace an essentially a new religion because if they felt that there was something about Christianity that was desirable, they were prepared to embrace it. It didn't mean necessarily they were going to throw overboard, to cast aside their own faith. Undoubtedly, there were many Africans on discovering that so-called Christian preachers were preaching their inherent inferiority as well, who recoiled from Christianity. There were other Africans who were forced to participate in Christian ceremonies because the master said they should, and generally were put in balconies while worshiping, not permitted to take communion. If they took communion along with the Gravesite, the white people and so on. So they must have had a very ambiguous and ambivalent attitude toward Christianity. And then there were other Africans who, in very large numbers, about whom very little has been written, who apparently had virtually no contact with Christianity. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. As late as 1833, according to William Freeling in his book Prelude to Civil War, he's quoting at this point an authority of the period, there were only, there was a total of 12 white missionaries working full-time in attempting to proselytize slaves. By that time, you've got over 3 million slaves, and you have 12 white men working full-time across the South, circuit riders so-called, attempting to proselytize the slaves. Now, they could only reach a tiny fraction of slaves with only 12 people working full-time.
To convert the slaves.
Attempting to convert them. These are Methodists, preachers attempting to convert the slaves. There were not enough Christian churches to service the slave masters and their families at this time in the history of the antebellum South. So that you had relatively few whites attempting to work full-time at converting slaves. Moreover, we know that the variety of Christianity that was offered, the African, was of such a nature that the African could see through it, could see that it was false, essentially phony. The Christianity of the master, obey your masters, be servants, be good servants, and so on. So that slaves were put off by that. At the same time, I think it's undeniable that that there were slaves who took to Christianity at a level that allowed them to give expression to a form of Christianity that was as exalted as anything to come out of the Western world in modern world history. These were the slaves who produced the Negro spirituals. These were the slaves who constructed folk tales in which a Christian spirit flows in some measure of purity and wholesomeness. And we should mention them because they would be, in some sense, the ancestors, the antecedents of the black preachers of our era, such as Martin Luther King Jr., who fought for the complete liberation of their people. So there were a variety of responses from the African to Christianity. What should be stressed, however, is that the degree of conversion of Africans to Christianity was not nearly as great as we've been led to believe. By 1865, perhaps the most liberal figure that I've come across for slave converts to Christianity is one that numbers approximately 1 million